tucked deep in the Appalachian foothills, where the blue haze of morning clings to pine needles like breath on glass. There lay a lake so quiet and secluded that even longtime locals forgot it existed. A crystal basin named Clearwater Hollow, fed by subterranean springs, mountain runoff, and time itself. The lake, ringed with thick hemlock and ancient rock formations, glistened like polished obsidian at dawn and turned gold by evening, its waters rarely disturbed by more than the occasional deer, heron, or drifting maple leaf. This tranquil oasis belonged by blood, paper, and deed to Joseph "Joe" McConnell, a retired hydrological engineer in his late 60s who had inherited the lake, the surrounding acres, and every drop of water flowing through it from his grandfather, a decorated World War II veteran who'd received the land through a rarely invoked Appalachian Veterans Settlement Grant in 1947. Joe lived alone in a weather-worn but sturdy log cabin he had helped his father rebuild with timber cut from their own property. A cabin perched up on a ridgeline overlooking the lake, obscured by towering trees and nestled just far enough from town to be forgotten by developers and realtors. A solitary man with a white beard and steady hands, Joe split his time between fishing, hiking, and quietly tending to the legacy of his grandfather, keeping the original land grant framed in the cabin above the fireplace and the updated digital land titles backed up on encrypted USB drives hidden in various places, including one inside an old fishing lure in his tackle box. Joe had no mortgage, no debts, no phone line, and rarely checked his mailbox, but he kept meticulous handwritten logs about the lake's health, water table shifts, erosion cycles, and even migratory bird nesting patterns. For him, Clearwater Hollow was more than land. It was heritage, science, and sacred duty. And yet, unbeknownst to Joe, change was brewing just over the ridge, fueled by suburban greed wrapped in manicured lawns and wrought iron gates. Summerglen Estates, a sprawling HOA-managed subdivision for upper-middle-class transplants fleeing city noise, had begun development 2 years earlier. Spearheaded by a self-important board president named Preston Langley, a man whose loafers never touched grass and who believed anything unpaved was a liability, the neighborhood quickly filled with beige stucco homes, tennis courts, and families wielding electric leaf blowers and HOA rulebooks thicker than the Bible. The community developers had seen aerial photos of Clearwater Hollow and assumed, through an appallingly shallow title search, that the water was public or county-managed. They viewed the shimmering lake not as a natural sanctuary but as an untapped amenity that could triple property values. When their records search turned up a dusty private trust name, McConnell Family Trust, EST 1947, they shrugged it off as defunct or forgotten. Nobody visited the trust office. Nobody sought the McConnell heir. Instead, the HOA proceeded with their expansion like a corporation convinced of manifest destiny. With great fanfare, they rolled in bulldozers and cranes, laying gravel paths and erecting luxury docks with steel pylons that sliced into the lakebed like surgical blades. They commissioned an eco-resort that was anything but ecological, complete with a floating tiki bar, pontoon rentals, a fake beach with imported white sand, and neon paddle boats shaped like flamingos. They even constructed Zen cabanas with Bluetooth speakers blaring spa music and poured concrete for yoga decks that crept dangerously close to Joe's shoreline boundary, never once consulting the landowner whose property they were desecrating. Joe noticed the first ripple of intrusion on a foggy April morning when the sound of jackhammers echoed off the water like thunder. From his porch, he watched plumes of dust rise across the lake and binoculars revealed the beginnings of a dock. A gleaming, gaudy construct with polished wood and rope railings, built right over one of the spawning coves where trout had bred for decades. He didn't panic. He didn't yell. Instead, he wrote the date in his notebook, took a photograph with his old Nikon, and waited. He believed in proof, not panic. Over the next weeks, contractors arrived in waves. They cleared brush, pounded steel, dumped chemicals into the lake without permits, and stirred the silt so badly that several native fish species stopped appearing in Joe's nightly surveys. Boats began appearing too, first private HOA-owned pontoons, then rented ones, then jet skis blaring music and spilling beer into the water. The HOA even put up floating buoys bearing the Summerglen logo, proudly declaring this was now Lake Summerglen, home of the Driftwood Cove Resort, with zero regard for legal naming rights. Joe watched it all with the cool detachment of a scientist conducting a study on invasive species. He updated his logbook with names, license plates, timestamps, noise levels, GPS coordinates of every new structure, and even overhead drone photos from his own DJI Phantom drone, which he flew daily to map the encroachment patterns. He collected screenshots of the HOA newsletters that bragged about the upcoming lakefront grand opening, complete with sunset wine tastings, boat parades, and exclusive community-only access. He listened in on public HOA Zoom meetings with a fake account named Brian Summerglen, where board members chuckled about how nobody really owned the lake and joked about how long it would take before they renamed the whole area Langley Landing. Joe saved every recording. He even collected water samples, taking them to a former colleague at the local university lab, where they confirmed elevated levels of pollutants from motor oil and cleaning agents. Still, Joe made no move, not yet. He understood systems, both mechanical and human, and he knew that revenge baked too quickly crumbled under pressure. Instead, he prepared. He updated his will, transferring all land and lake ownership into a renewed trust registered under federal protection statutes related to environmental preservation. He hired a legal assistant to file quiet title actions on all contiguous parcels. And then he contacted Amanda Keene, a firebrand environmental and property rights attorney with a reputation for destroying corporations in courtrooms and settlements alike. Amanda, young but ferociously competent, had grown up in a nearby town and immediately took an interest when Joe showed her the files. Within days, she had confirmed everything. The HOA had trespassed, constructed commercial structures on private property, failed to obtain permits, and caused measurable environmental harm. She grinned as she flipped through the evidence and told Joe calmly, "They built an empire on your land without asking. We're going to make them regret every nail they hammered into that lake." Joe nodded, sipped his black coffee, and said, "Good, I'm ready." But he still didn't alert the HOA. That would come later. For now, he let them continue to dig their hole. Summerglen's resort opened officially that July with champagne, drone fireworks, and coverage in the regional lifestyle magazine. The HOA billed residents a special amenity access fee of $2,500 and promised exclusive perks like kayak rentals, paddleboard yoga, and sunset cocktail cruises. Hundreds attended the launch party, completely unaware that the ground under their deck chairs belonged to someone watching from the treeline with a camera and a binder labeled Litigation Package A. Preston Langley gave a self-congratulatory speech thanking visionaries and investors for making Lake Summerglen a reality, all while standing on a dock anchored illegally into Joe's land. That night, Joe filed the first cease and desist letter through Amanda, sent certified to the HOA office to Preston's law firm, and just for style, taped one to the door of the Summerglen Welcome Center with a red thumbtack. The letter cited legal property boundaries, detailed each instance of illegal development, and demanded the immediate dismantling of all structures, a full environmental remediation, and a formal written apology. The HOA board, smug and oblivious, laughed it off. Preston even posted about it on the Summerglen social media forum, calling Joe a hermit troll who had no claim to anything beyond his weeds and squirrels. That post, like everything else, was screenshot and archived. What they didn't realize was that the land trust Joe inherited had never lapsed, had never defaulted, and had been paid in full every year via a small mineral rights lease Joe had signed decades earlier with a natural gas company, keeping it legally and financially active. The trust had ironclad borders, federally recorded GPS-stamped boundaries, and legal precedents thanks to decades of usage, logging records, and tax payments. Amanda filed a formal lawsuit 3 weeks later, demanding $38 million in damages and permanent removal of all structures and infrastructure encroaching on Joe's property. The lawsuit made the regional news. When reporters came calling, Joe declined interviews but allowed one drone photo of himself fishing alone on the lake with the encroaching tiki bar in the background, an image that went viral, symbolizing quiet power against suburban arrogance. Within days, the HOA began receiving countersuits from residents demanding refunds as the community's once pristine image began unraveling. Insurance companies pulled coverage, developers rescinded offers, and contractors demanded payment for structures now embroiled in litigation. Still, Joe remained silent, watching from his ridge, logging every development with quiet satisfaction. He wasn't in it for the headlines, he was in it for justice. Justice for the trout who no longer spawned. Justice for his grandfather who'd carved this land with calloused hands. Justice for every man who'd ever been steamrolled by arrogance disguised as progress. The lake remained still, like the eye of a storm waiting to surge. Joe baited his hook with a fat worm, cast it into the mirror-glass water, and smiled. The real storm had only just begun. As the lawsuit gained momentum and headlines across the state screamed phrases like, "Retired engineer declares war on HOA," and "Eco-resort built on stolen land," Clearwater Hollow transformed from a forgotten sanctuary into the epicenter of one of the most explosive land disputes in modern state history, a dispute that quickly evolved from simple trespass litigation into a case that would redefine property law, environmental responsibility, and corporate arrogance for decades to come. Joe McConnell, whose name now danced through news cycles and legal blogs, remained as serene as the lake he protected, meticulously keeping his daily routines intact. 5 a.m. coffee with his hawks, drone patrols over the lake at sunrise, data logging by mid-morning, quiet legal strategy calls with Amanda by noon, and evenings spent fishing with a satisfied calm few men ever achieve in the eye of an unfolding financial hurricane. What the HOA hadn't yet realized was that the lawsuit was only the first domino. Amanda's team had discovered deeper infractions, including backdated environmental inspection reports forged by the Summerglen developers, fraudulent easement filings submitted with a forged digital signature of a dead county registrar, and, perhaps most damning, the unlicensed draining of a protected wetland feeding into the south edge of Clearwater Hollow, all of which Joe and Amanda packaged into a supplemental complaint filed with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, and the Department of the Interior. Suddenly, this was no longer a local civil suit. It had morphed into a full-blown federal investigation involving environmental crimes, real estate fraud, and corruption at the county zoning level. The HOA board began to splinter. 3 members resigned quietly under legal advisement, and Preston Langley, the iron-fisted president who once mocked Joe as a weeds and squirrels hermit, now found himself subpoenaed by both state and federal prosecutors, his real estate license suspended, his assets frozen, and his mugshot plastered next to headlines reading, "Langley lied, Lake cried." Summerglen Estates, once a hotbed of brunches and block parties, fell into chaos. Residents divided into factions, those who demanded restitution for the special resort fees they'd paid, those who feared property devaluation, and a small but growing group who began showing up on Joe's side of the lake bearing homemade pies, apology letters, and requests to help clean up the ecological mess their HOA had made. Joe, ever the stoic, accepted their gestures with grace but didn't let sentimentality cloud his legal pursuit. He was building something far greater than retribution. During the second month of litigation, Amanda received a quiet offer from the developer's parent company, $45 million to settle, sealed with a full NDA and destruction of all photos and data. Joe refused without blinking. "They don't get to erase this," he said simply, pouring coffee into his dented thermos. Instead, he doubled down through a friend at the university's business department. Joe arranged for a team of grad students in environmental economics and GIS mapping to assist in modeling the long-term ecological and financial impact of the resort's damage, proving that his lake had not only been illegally used but that its future value far exceeded any number the HOA or their developers had considered. The models showed that, left untouched, Clearwater Hollow could be restored into a protected sanctuary worth hundreds of millions in government conservation grants, private ecotourism contracts, and even water rights sales to drought-stricken counties. When Amanda presented the findings at a federal mediation hearing, the opposing attorneys went pale. What they had assumed was a quiet mountain lake owned by a reclusive retiree turned out to be one of the most underutilized natural assets in the entire eastern region. It wasn't just a lake, it was a gold mine, and they had built tiki bars and flamingo paddle boats on top of it like fools dancing on a buried fortune. Now desperate, the developers tried public sympathy campaigns, releasing tearful apology videos, attempting to rebrand the resort as a co-managed conservation initiative, even staging a fake community cleanup day that Joe exposed on social media by flying his drone overhead and capturing actors being paid cash to pick up stage trash along a beach made of non-native sand. The public turned on the HOA like wolves. Residents filed a class action suit of their own. Local news drones circled the lake daily. Environmental protesters from nearby universities began picketing the resort entrance with signs reading, "You don't own the lake," and "Ask the trout what they think." Meanwhile, Joe quietly began preparing for the future he had envisioned since the first nail hit the dock. Through Amanda's expanding legal network, He was introduced to a portfolio manager for a green capital investment firm in New York who specialized in buying and converting misused land into federally protected eco-assets. Joe brought them out to the property by helicopter and gave them a private tour of the lake, walking them through the impact zones, showing them before and after drone footage, and laying out the data models. They were stunned, not just by the scale of damage but by the scale of potential. Joe proposed a plan. Once the lawsuits resolved and all illegal structures were dismantled, he would sell the entire lake and surrounding acreage, not to developers, but to a coalition of environmental and educational partners that would transform Clearwater Hollow into the largest privately funded wilderness restoration and aquatic research preserve in the eastern United States. The firm offered a staggering estimate north of $1.2 billion in total asset projection based on carbon credit offsets, sustainable tourism licensing, and long-term water rights leasing. Amanda's eyes lit up when the number landed on her desk. "They tried to steal your lake, Joe," she said. "Now you're going to sell it for more than they ever imagined it was worth." Joe didn't smile, but a flicker of warmth crossed his weathered face. "My grandfather would have liked that," he murmured. But before the sale could proceed, the land had to be legally cleansed, everything built by the HOA had to be removed, every structure disassembled, every drop of unnatural chemical filtered out. The court order came down swiftly in Joe's favor. A federal judge ruled that the HOA had acted with gross negligence and fraudulent assumption of property rights, awarding Joe not just $75 million in damages but also full injunctive control over the land's cleanup and restoration timeline. The ruling made national news. HOA reform activists hailed it as a landmark case. Real estate law professors rewrote their syllabi. Joe became an accidental icon, interviewed by NPR, profiled in National Geographic, and even offered a book deal, which he declined. "I'm not here to tell stories," he said. "I'm here to protect what's real." The dismantling of the resort was broadcast live by local media, pontoons dragged ashore and auctioned off, tiki bars torn down, imported sand trucked out, and the garish Lake Summerglen signs ripped from the docks and dumped into county evidence lockers. Joe oversaw it all, clipboard in hand, wearing his faded Army surplus jacket and a trucker hat that simply read "Waterwinds." At the final day of teardown, as the last floating cabana was hauled away, Joe stood on the shoreline with Amanda and the portfolio manager from the investment firm. "It's clean again," Amanda said softly. "Almost." Joe nodded. "Give it a winter, let it breathe. Then it's ready." In the months that followed, Joe finalized the sale, structured as a legacy trust wherein 80% of the proceeds would be reinvested in conservation and public environmental education programs, with the remaining 20% structured into a charitable annuity for Joe's estate, ensuring the land would remain undeveloped and protected for generations. The final sale price? $1.78 billion. The largest private lake transaction in the region's recorded history. Joe didn't buy a mansion or a yacht. He kept the cabin, now upgraded with solar panels and a satellite internet connection donated by the foundation, and he hired a team of researchers to begin documenting the lake's slow, miraculous return to health. The trout came back. The eagles nested again. The laughter of tourists and HOA parties faded into wind and birdsong. And as the sun set on Clearwater Hollow each evening, the lake reflected more than just light. It reflected justice, resilience, and the quiet, unstoppable strength of a man who knew the value of water long before anyone else did. After the triumphant legal victory and the historic multi-billion-dollar sale of Clearwater Hollow, Joe McConnell found himself thrust into a world he never sought: the spotlight of environmental advocacy, high-stakes philanthropy, and the complicated politics of land conservation. The lake that once symbolized personal solace and quiet rebellion had become a beacon for eco-conscious investors, government agencies, and activists determined to rewrite the narrative of land stewardship in a rapidly changing world. But Joe was not a man who enjoyed fame or fanfare. His satisfaction came from the tangible: the ripples on the water, the return of native species, the restoration of wetlands that once thrived before human greed scarred the land. He embraced his new role with a humble determination, balancing media interviews with hands-on restoration work, often seen wearing muddy boots and a battered hat, leaning over seedlings, or testing water samples alongside young ecologists who had flocked to Clearwater Hollow like moths to a flame. The foundation created by the sale was named Clearwater Legacy Trust, dedicated not only to preserving the lake but to funding environmental education and sustainable community development projects across the region. Joe's insistence on community involvement led to partnerships with local schools, tribal leaders, and conservation groups, transforming the lake from a private battleground into a shared sanctuary. A living classroom where future generations could learn about the delicate interplay between water, land, and life. Yet, despite the goodwill and progress, challenges soon emerged. Powerful interests in nearby urban development began circling like vultures, eyeing the pristine waters and restored lands as prime targets for commercial expansion, infrastructure projects, and luxury housing. Joe found himself navigating a labyrinth of political lobbying, zoning hearings, and public relations battles, determined to keep Clearwater Hollow's new status secure. His personal life, once simple and secluded, grew increasingly complicated as well. Old friends distanced themselves, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of Joe's transformation from quiet retiree to environmental crusader, while new alliances formed with scientists, lawyers, and activists whose passion for preservation matched his own. His bond with Amanda deepened as they strategized against attempts to dilute protections or introduce backdoor developments. Their late-night calls filled with urgent planning and occasional moments of levity that reminded Joe of the friendships and trust forged through adversity. Meanwhile, the media frenzy showed no signs of abating. Documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reports chronicled Clearwater Hollow's journey from exploitation to redemption, and Joe's face became a symbol of resilience, integrity, and the power of one individual to challenge entrenched systems. But Joe never lost sight of the lake itself. In early spring, as ice melted and migratory birds returned, he walked the shoreline with a new sense of hope and responsibility. The water shimmered under the sun, clear and deep, teeming with life that had rebounded faster than anyone expected. Restoration teams reported the return of rare amphibians, native wildflowers carpeted the marshlands, and water quality indicators showed remarkable improvement. Yet, Joe knew the battle was far from over. Climate change, invasive species, and regional water politics loomed large, threatening to undo years of progress if vigilance waned. To bolster long-term protection, Joe championed a multi-agency watershed management plan, leveraging the trust's funds to collaborate with state environmental departments, local municipalities, and indigenous groups, ensuring that Clearwater Hollow's health depended on a network of stewards rather than a single guardian. This inclusive approach brought new challenges. Balancing diverse stakeholder interests required patience, negotiation skills Joe never imagined needing, and a willingness to compromise without sacrificing core values. During one heated town hall meeting, tensions flared as representatives from a neighboring county pushed for a pipeline project that risked contaminating the lake's feeder streams. Joe listened intently as residents voiced fears, questions, and frustrations. Drawing on years of experience confronting powerful developers, he calmly outlined alternative solutions, supported by data and expert testimony, advocating for green infrastructure and sustainable water management practices. His measured approach won over many skeptics and forged a fragile coalition of allies determined to oppose the pipeline, marking another victory in an ongoing saga of stewardship and resistance. Meanwhile, the trust's educational programs flourished. Scholarships were awarded to young environmentalists, citizen science initiatives engaged local communities, and annual festivals celebrated the lake's rebirth with music, art, and storytelling that connected people to the land in ways Joe had never imagined possible. These gatherings became a source of renewal for Joe, reminders that the fight for preservation was also a fight for connection, culture, and hope. Despite these triumphs, Joe grappled with the personal costs of his new life. The financial security the sale provided brought unexpected pressures, including offers to commercialize the lake's brand, turn it into a tourist destination, or license its image for corporate gain. Proposals Joe rejected outright, unwilling to commodify the sanctuary his family had protected for generations. His relationship with his estranged sister, who had once dismissed his activism as quixotic, slowly thawed as she witnessed the impact of his work, eventually joining the trust's advisory board to help bridge community divides and promote inclusive governance. Yet shadows lingered. The scars left by the HOA's illegal resort remained: pockets of soil contaminated by chemicals, invasive plants introduced during construction, and subtle shifts in the lake's ecosystem required ongoing remediation. Joe often spent solitary hours patrolling these zones, cataloging changes, and consulting with ecologists on the best restoration strategies. His intimate knowledge of the land was both a gift and a burden, binding him to a responsibility that extended beyond legal titles or financial transactions. One autumn afternoon, as leaves turned fiery red and gold, Joe received a letter from a federal agency inviting him to testify before Congress on land conservation policy. The invitation marked a significant milestone, his expertise and experience recognized at the highest levels, providing a platform to influence national environmental legislation. Preparing for the hearing consumed weeks of research, collaboration with policy experts, and heartfelt reflection on the journey that began with a simple act of defiance against an overreaching HOA. Standing before the committee, Joe spoke candidly about the intersection of property rights, environmental stewardship, and community empowerment, urging lawmakers to enact stronger protections for natural resources threatened by unchecked development and to support initiatives that prioritize ecological health alongside economic growth. His testimony resonated widely, sparking renewed public interest in land conservation and inspiring other communities facing similar struggles. As winter settled in, Joe returned to Clearwater Hollow with a renewed sense of purpose. Snow blanketed the landscape, muffling sounds and slowing the rhythms of restoration, but also providing a time for reflection and planning. He reviewed the Trust's strategic goals, assessed ongoing projects, and envisioned future endeavors, expanding research partnerships, enhancing public access in sustainable ways, and fostering resilience against climate impacts. The lake, frozen and silent, held promise beneath its icy surface. Joe understood that his journey was part of a larger story, one of stewardship passed from generation to generation, of humans learning to coexist with the land rather than dominate it. And as he stood at the edge of the frozen water, breathing in the crisp air and watching the stars reflect in the ice, Joe felt a profound connection to the past, present, and future, a legacy not measured in billions of dollars but in the enduring health of a lake that had become a symbol of hope, justice, and the quiet strength of one man's unwavering commitment to protect what truly mattered. With the passage of seasons bringing change to both the land and Joe McConnell's life, the final chapter of his journey with Clearwater Hollow unfolded not in a blaze of headlines but in the steady, sometimes unseen work of legacy building, community healing, and visionary stewardship that would ripple far beyond the shores of his once troubled lake. The multi-billion-dollar sale had settled, lawsuits were closed, and the lake had shed the scars of greed and mismanagement, but Joe understood that true preservation was an ongoing commitment, one that demanded vigilance, innovation, and collaboration in a world where environmental threats multiplied and new challenges arose with relentless urgency. The Clearwater Legacy Trust, now firmly established as a leading model of sustainable conservation, expanded its scope to encompass watershed-wide initiatives addressing water quality, habitat connectivity, and climate resilience, leveraging cutting-edge science and community knowledge alike. Joe's daily routine evolved to include mentoring young environmental leaders, consulting on policy reform, and facilitating dialogues between stakeholders whose interests sometimes conflicted but who shared a common desire to safeguard the natural world. His modest cabin on the lake's edge remained his sanctuary, a humble reminder of the long path from solitary protester to influential conservationist. Over the years, the Trust's efforts bore fruit. The lake flourished with biodiversity once thought lost, wetlands rebounded, and migratory bird populations increased dramatically, attracting researchers and birdwatchers from around the globe. Educational programs inspired a new generation of environmental stewards, many of whom credited Joe's story as the spark that ignited their passion for nature and justice. Yet Joe never sought the limelight. He often retreated to quiet moments by the water, casting a line into the shimmering surface, reflecting on the improbable journey that began with an HOA's arrogance and ended with a movement that transcended property boundaries and political divides. The community surrounding Clearwater Hollow grew more interconnected and resilient, shaped by shared stewardship and mutual respect fostered through years of inclusive governance and transparent decision-making. Challenges remained, of course. Climate change brought unpredictable weather patterns, invasive species tested restoration efforts, and political winds shifted unpredictably. But Joe's vision of a balanced coexistence between human needs and ecological integrity guided every step forward. In a bittersweet turn, Joe's health began to decline in his late 70s, a reminder of his own mortality even as the lake's vitality surged. Friends and colleagues rallied to honor his contributions, organizing annual festivals celebrating the lake's rebirth and establishing scholarships in his name to support young ecologists and activists. Before stepping back from daily operations, Joe penned a letter to the community, a heartfelt testament to the power of perseverance, integrity, and the profound connection between people and the natural world. "This lake is not mine," he wrote, "but a gift we all share. Protect it fiercely, cherish it deeply, and remember that every ripple is a promise to those who will come after us. As he passed stewardship to a board of passionate leaders committed to his principles, Joe found peace in knowing that Clearwater Hollow's legacy was secure. His final days were spent surrounded by family, friends, and the land that had shaped him. On a serene autumn afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the water, Joe McConnell quietly slipped away, his life a testament to the quiet strength of one man's resolve to defend what is just and true. In the years that followed, his story became legend, told around campfires, taught in classrooms, and celebrated in policy halls as a beacon of hope and resilience. Clearwater Hollow remained a sanctuary, a living symbol of justice reclaimed and nature restored, inspiring countless others to stand up for their own sacred places. And though Joe was gone, his spirit lingered in the gentle lapping of the lake's waves, the song of returning birds, and the enduring promise that even in the face of greed and destruction, one person's courage could change the course of history.